Hey guys, welcome back to another top 10 list. Today I have my list of the top 10 decades of all time. Right, and I've split these decades into three groups. So we're going to start off with the top 10 political decades of all time, starting at number 4, the 1930s. The Great Depression was a looming threat in the 30s that many government officials worked to fix. All over the nation, the lack of jobs and money was destroying the economy. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, was made by Hoover in the Great Depression as a way for the U.S. government to give money to businesses to help stimulate the economy. It is seen as one of Hoover's too little too late methods to curb the Great Depression. However, his successor, FDR, and his New Deal was seen as a much better set of policies. The New Deal allowed many unemployed U.S. citizens to get jobs working for government agencies and create public works projects like railroads and parks. Number 3 is the 1940s. World War II was a looming threat in the 40s. As the war raged across Europe and Asia, the U.S. tried to remain mostly neutral while supporting its allies through means like cash and carry or the destroyer deal. However, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, FDR declared war on Japan and Germany. One of the major implications of this was the rounding up of Japanese Americans into internment camps. This led to the infamous Korematsu versus United States case. Number 2. The 2000s. The Middle East was a looming threat in the early 2000s. On September 11th, the largest terrorist attack on U.S. soil took place. This attack was by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, which sparked the War on Terror. The U.S. sent soldiers into Afghanistan to hunt down Al-Qaeda, a conflict that only ended last year. Back at home, the U.S. really cracked down on security, such as raising the airport security. George Bush also enacted the USA Patriot Act, which allowed the U.S. government to essentially spy on its citizens, totally unwarranted. Also, the 2008 housing crisis had impacts such as lowering restrictions for banks. And number 1 are the 1970s. There were a lot of looming threats in the 70s. First, Nixon had ended the Vietnam War. After fighting for over 20 years and getting basically nowhere, the United States left Vietnam in 1973. Also in 1973 was the first OPEC oil embargo. OPEC used the embargo to target Israeli allies, and the United States was one of them. The price of gas shot up and made life very difficult. Also in the 70s was the Watergate scandal, where President Nixon was found to be using dirty tricks like bugging and wiretapping the Democrats to help in his re-election campaign. He was found out and resigned, but his successor, Ford, pardoned him of all wrongdoing. Alright, that was the top 10 political decades of all time. Now, in our top 10 economic decades, starting off at number 4 in the 1950s. The 50s were an economic boom for the U.S. The Federal Highway Act by Eisenhower directed a lot of money into building new interstate highways. Also in the 50s, the domino theory was sweeping across the United States, which stated that letting certain countries like Vietnam or Korea fall into a communist government and economy would lead to other countries following suit. Probably because of this, in 1950, NSC 86 was signed and allowed the U.S. to expand its military budget to combat the Soviet Union. Number 3, the 1920s. The 20s were also an economic boom for the U.S. With prohibition in place, many people turned to speakeasies or underground bars and pubs that illegally handed out alcohol. According to some, Americans spent more on alcohol during Prohibition than in any other time period. There was also a lot of people buying things on credit. The credit system allowed people to buy cool new gadgets like automobiles and refrigerators that they wouldn't normally be able to afford by spacing out their payments. There was also a lot of stock trading. However, this overspeculation in the stock market led to the Black Tuesday stock market crash and the Great Depression. Number 2 are the 1970s. The 70s were an economic bust for the U.S. First, the US was stuck in a nasty bout of stagflation. First, the OPEC oil crisis of 1973 raised prices on a lot of things. Businesses tried many ways to save money, resulting in an upward spiral of costs and a downward spiral of wages. And in California in 1978, Proposition 13 was made to limit the property tax in that state. And number one is the 1930s. The 30s were also an economic bust for the US. First, the Great Depression meant that no one was making any money. Second, the Dust Bowl had raised the price of food by a lot. To combat this, FDR made his New Deal, which attempted to combat this situation by creating government agencies and new jobs for US citizens. Alright, and that was our top 10 economic decades of all time. And now our final list is the top 10 social-cultural decades of all time, starting with number 4, the 1920s. The 20s were a big era in American history. First, there was Prohibition and the culture surrounding it. Think The Great Gatsby. With speakeasies, flappers, bob cuts, and the like, many people remember the 20s as a golden age right before the Great Depression. Modern fashion was really born in the 20s, but with things like baggy pants and women being allowed to wear normal clothes. However, there were also things like a second wave of killing by the KKK that were engineered to halt the progressive era. Number 3, the 1980s. While many people remember the 80s as a time of cool action movies, video games, and music, the 80s also had some less than ideal cultural movements. First, there were many race issues, such as the ones highlighted in the Ward's Cove Packing and Martin v. Wilkes cases. The first looked at white people getting more favorable jobs than colored people, and the second focused on people of color getting more favorable jobs than whites. There were also the abortion issues that the nation faced in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade. And finally, there was Ronald Reagan and the New Right. This movement focused mostly on overturning the very liberal political and social climate of the 70s. A lot of new right-wing people came onto the scene, creating the neoconservative identity. Number 2, on the 1960s. The 60s were a time of big change. First, the Vietnam War raging and the deaths of the soldiers fighting in it outraged many Americans. They did not like to see their brothers dying for a cause that they did not deem to be worth so much. A lot of people protested by marching in the streets or burning their draft cards. Connected to this movement was the whole hippie culture. You know, peace and love, dude. Hippie culture also promoted the usage of certain psychedelic substances like LSD. There was also the Civil Rights Movement, where figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. moved to combat segregation and discrimination in the American South. His movement had a lot of impact, as he is one of the few people whose birthday is a national holiday in the US. And number 1 for the most social cultural decade of all time is the 1870s. The 1870s were another time of big change. The US had just gotten out of its Civil War. The South was in Reconstruction after the war, and a lot of big changes were being made. First, a set of new amendments to the Constitution gave slaves freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. This was also one of the first big steps in the Civil Rights Movement. But a lot of people opposed this movement, such as the KKK. Alright, and now we have the top 3 decades of all times in every category. And number 3 are the 1920s. A lot of cool things happened in the 1920s. For example, Prohibition and the Prohibition culture was a big part of the 1920s and one of its defining characteristics. There was also the issue of the second wave of the KKK. And finally, Black Tuesday started off the events that led to number 2, the 1930s. The 30s were a time defined by economic strife. My English teacher described the 20s as the party and the 30s were the hangover. Black Tuesday was the start of the Great Depression. There was also the Dust Bowl, which destroyed much of America's crops. However, FDR and his New Deal attempted to remedy many of these problems. And number 1, the most decade of all time, is the 1970s. The 70s were another time marked by strife. First, the energy crises made life very hard in America by raising the prices on everything. Part of this was a lot of unemployment, and you have the stagflation that marked the decade. There was also the Watergate scandal, which made national headlines. and you have what is, in my opinion, the most influential decade in American history. Thanks guys for watching another amazing top 10 list by me. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video with a friend. Hit that notification bell, and I will see you whenever I upload next. Goodbye.